Hey guys, I currently only have one crosscut sled, and that's this monster of a sled right here. This table saw sled does an okay job and it's very accurate, but I think it's kind of a pain to have to break out this big huge table saw sled just to cut small parts like loose tenon stock for floating tenons. So what I thought I'd do today is make a much smaller table saw sled that's a lot easier to handle when you're just cutting small parts. For the base of the sled, I'm just going to use some scrap 3/4 inch plywood that I had laying around the shop. So the first thing I'm going to do is make the runners that will ride in the miter track of the table saw. In order to get a really nice fit on my miter track, what I plan on doing is making fine adjustments to my table saw fence until I get that perfect fit. In my opinion, the best way to make fine adjustments to your table saw fence is to use a dial indicator. So what I've done is I set my dial indicator to the right side of my fence and I've zeroed the dial indicator phase to 0. So after I've made my first cut at 0, I can make fine adjustments to my table saw fence and I'll know exactly how much I'm removing with each adjustment. Nice fit. Now because I have a piece of stock that's thick enough, all I need to do is tilt this thing on its side and cut it right in half and I'll have 2 runners for my sled. This piece of scrap ply has a little bit of a bow to it. It doesn't sit exactly flat on the table saw surface. So I think what I'll do is before I attach the runners to the base of the table saw sled, I'm going to attach the backer board, and hopefully what that'll do is flatten out the bottom so that I can attach the runners. If I attach the runners first before I flatten out this piece of plywood, what would happen is the runners would spread out slightly as the piece of plywood is flattened out from the backer board, and then it wouldn't ride as nicely. I placed the runners that I made earlier in the miter track, and we'll just slide the base of the table saw sled over top, and I'll make a mark where I want the first runner to be. The second runner is going to be a little trickier. So I have the miter track lined up with my marks on my sled, and I'll just temporarily clamp this in place. Now I'll take a square and just square up the back end of the miter track to the base of the table saw sled. And I'll just go ahead and temporarily clamp that one in place. Okay, so now we need to attach the second runner, and that one is a little trickier than the first one. So what I like to do is have the miter track underneath the sled and slide both the base of the sled and the track forward, just so you can get enough room to drive a screw from underneath. Now that we have the first screw in the second runner, all we need to do is take the sled out of the miter track and flip it around, and we can put in the second screw. I went ahead and attached my sled fence to the body of the table saw sled using only one screw so that the fence is free to swivel forward and back on the left-hand side of the fence. Now I'm going to show you a really cool way to align this sled fence to 90 degrees. And this is where a lot of woodworkers, I think, start to cringe. But I'm going to show you a really cool method that's fast and accurate and 10 times easier than the more popular 5-cut method. I've demoed this method in the past, but I think it's worth showing again because I think it's pretty cool. So what I did was I placed a square on the right-hand side of my fence, and I used a stop block to help keep the square positioned. And on the right-hand side of the square, I've attached a dial indicator with a magnetic base. Now to show you how this method works, I'm going to push the sled fence forward to exaggerate a misalignment. And watch what happens to the dial indicator as I push the sled forward. As I push the sled forward, you can see the dial indicator needle move counterclockwise. So a counterclockwise movement tells me that the sled fence is too far forward and out of alignment from 90 degrees. Now watch what happens when I pull the sled fence toward me and misalign it in the opposite direction. Now the needle will move to the right, or clockwise, in the clockwise direction. So a clockwise direction tells me that my sled fence is too far back. So by watching which direction the dial indicator moves, and by roughly how much, I know which direction to move the sled fence in order to make the adjustment, and by roughly how much. Okay, so watch as I bring this sled fence into alignment using this method, and hopefully you'll agree that it's a lot faster than the 5-cut method. And it's also just as accurate, if not more accurate, depending on the length of the square that you're using. Okay, because the needle is moving clockwise, I know that I have the fence too far back, so I'll move it forward. Still moving clockwise, I need to move it more forward. It's moving clockwise, but not as much, so I'll move the sled fence forward a little bit more. Still moving clockwise, but very, very little, so I'll just make the smallest adjustment forward in the sled fence. And see what we got now. Very little movement forward, right to the right. So I'll move the sled fence forward just a little smidge. And let's see what we got. No movement on the dial indicator needle. So now I know that my sled fence is a perfect 90 degrees. And I didn't have to make 5 cuts. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll slide the sled forward, being sure not to move the sled fence. And I'll place a clamp on it. So now all I need to do is drive a screw from underneath, and this fence is secure. So after we've secured the opposite side of the fence with a screw, we can go ahead and recheck with the dial indicator to make sure that we're still at a perfect 90 degrees. It moves by about 1/1000th of an inch from front to back. Okay, so that's all I've got today, guys. Hope you've enjoyed watching me build my more manageable small parts table saw sled. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. Thanks a lot.